In Peniche, Portugal, the Atlantic is not background or postcard. It is foreground, employer, judge, and inheritance. Houses face it the way people face a difficult relative, warily, with respect, with the kind of affection that is built out of familiarity and grudging awe. Nets dry on walls like laundry. Rust blooms on iron the moment anyone forgets to wipe salt away. On good days the water is hammered blue and bright as a promise. On bad days it is the color of a bruise that will not be explained. Children grow up knowing the names of winds before they know the capitals of provinces, and old men sit on overturned crates at the harbor tracing currents in the air with their hands, as if they might write the weather into obedience. Among those men was Joaquim Duarte, O Velho do Mar, the old man of the sea. Though he was still 63 the spring he disappeared. He had been born on a February morning when rain beat the chapel roof flat, the second son of a fisherman and the grandson of another. His first memory was of the taste of salt on his lips and the scrape of net cord across a palm. His second was of his father laughing in a way that sounded exactly like a wave breaking under the quay. He learned to row before he learned to read. And when the teacher asked him why he missed school on Tuesdays, he said, "Tuesdays are when the sardines run." And the teacher, who had a brother lost 8 miles off Cabo Carvuero in '58, shut her mouth around a lecture and taught him on Wednesdays instead. As a boy, he knew the names of the local rocks and the lines the tides drew when they were feeling honest. He learned which gulls lied and which told him where fish might be. He could splice rope at 9 and sharpen a knife without a whetstone at 10. By 12, he went out with the men when weather allowed, crouched in the bow with a prayer for hands. By 20, he had his own boat, bought on credit and hope, christened with a bottle of cheap vinho because Anna, dark-haired, bright-eyed, laughed like rain on a metal roof, said you should never send a boat into the world without letting it drink first. They married under a string of paper flags and a sky the color of forgiveness. He promised her a kitchen with real tiles one day and a radio that picked up Lisbon. She promised him a long life and children who would roll mussels out of their shells with their thumbs and grow up with the sea in their hair. Anna fell sick 10 years later and never got well. The doctors in Caldas called it one thing, and the ones in Lisbon called it another, and the women in the village said it was sorrow, because sorrow is what people call an enemy they cannot study with instruments. She died in a room that smelled of bleach and candle smoke, while Joaquim sat outside on a plastic chair and wore his hands out praying to a god he believed in partly and negotiated with daily. After the funeral, he returned to the boat the next morning because time is a teacher who is not interested in your homework, and because the sea does not postpone. The kitchen never got its tiles. He never married again. He hardened into the shape of someone who has only one vocation left. The boat was called Santa Luzia, after the saint whose eyes look outward finally and always, the patron of seafarers and of those who need to see. She was 20 feet if you measured honestly and 22 if you included the hope in the bow. Joaquim painted her a green that faded over years to a patient gray. She wore 3 patches on her hull, each a different wood from a different decade, each a story told twice. Once when it happened, and once when someone who had not been there needed to understand why the patch was there at all. In winter, he rolled her onto trestles and scraped barnacles off her belly with the same attention he had once given to shaving before Anna's mother's Sunday dinners. In spring, he laid new paint down the way patient men lay brick, evenly, believing in layers. He spoke to her, not superstitious talk. No, practical talk, the way one speaks to an animal that must know they are seen if it is to work alongside you without inventing a reason to misbehave. His house was a narrow white rectangle with a blue stripe the color of Fatima's cloak. Inside were rooms that knew how to hold cold in summer and damp in winter. On a nail by the door hung a wool cap that had outlived trends and weather and patience. A shelf held a tobacco tin, a small knife with a clean edge, a rosary smooth in the thumb from using it, as much to think as to pray. On the wall were photographs. Anna on the doorstep with the cat that adopted them. Joaquim at 20 with a net so full of sardines he looked short beside it. The boat at launch on a morning nobody knew would become a metaphor. In a drawer lay a notebook wrapped in plastic with labels and a hand that was tidy only when the subject mattered. Tides, catches, fog lines, things not to forget. Joaquim's mornings were the same in the way prayers are the same and never the same. Wake before light, stand at the door and read the wind with his skin, check the barometer that had belonged to his father and then his father's friend, it being that kind of neighborhood where instruments inherit people. He took coffee thick as a grudge, bread warmed on a pan, a wedge of cheese wrapped in paper. He laced boots that had become shaped to his feet and would have been odd on anyone else. He kissed his fingers and touched the Santa Luzia's bow with them, a sacrament for which no priest was required. He pushed off into a dark that had weight, not the lack of light but the presence of unlit water, and he rowed with economy like a good sentence. If there was an outboard, he used it as if it were a favor he would have to repay. May 14th, 2008 began with the kind of dawn fisherman respect and pretend not to. Red under the clouds, the old warning in the sky's old mouth. The radio whispered the kind of forecast that can be called cautious and can be called obvious depending on who needs to hear what. Low moving and fast from the northwest, wind rising, rain late, storm likely. Younger men stood at the harbor and checked screens and compared app to app, and then, the way people born into networks do, checked with their friends to see what conclusion they were supposed to draw. A few stayed ashore for the first time since February. Others went and promised the ones left behind the usual lies. Not far. Back soon. We'll keep her in sight. Joaquim listened, tilted his head in the direction of the cliffs the way hounds do when they have already decided. He did not argue with anyone. He packed as he always packed, blade wrapped in rags, line, hooks, weight, the wool cap, the tobacco tin, the notebook in its plastic, a sandwich he would eat untouched if the day came full and untouched if the day came empty. He kissed his fingers and touched the bow. Someone shouted from the quay, half joke and half warning. He lifted a hand and rode into the swells that were not yet a problem and would later be the only problem. By noon the light had become a gray you could cut with a knife, but would prefer not to. The horizon blurred into a strip where certainty had once lived. Waves developed shoulders. The wind began to talk at the level where conversation is possible and went on toward the level where negotiation is no longer part of the program. Men out on the water looked at one another across dark climes and thought of wives and mothers and fathers and children and promised nothing aloud they could not keep. Radios grew busy and then formal. A trawler off the Berlingas crackled a location and a return path, and out of habit mentioned the color of the birds on the water, as if that had anything to do with it. The storm stood up all at once, as coastal storms do when they have decided nobody is looking after them anymore. Rain came sideways. The sea forget its own rhythm and replaced it with a new one that required different feet. From the cliffs at Cabo Carvuero, people watched boats vanish from view and then appear again pinned against foam. Most turned in tight arcs and ran toward harbor with their bows high and their pride lower. One by one they came back with nets empty and faces not. The harbor swallowed them, clapped them on the shoulders, told them to go home and come back, said nothing about the ones who did not come. By late afternoon the dock knew. Joaquim had not come back. Alarm, in fishing towns, is not sirens first. It is men not making jokes, women not making coffee. The maritime police were called and said the right sentences while lacing boots. We will mobilize. We have assets. We are on our way. The Coast Guard launched cutters into a sea that did not want them and did not get to vote. Helicopters pounded low, searchlights carving cones in a water that threw the light back because it was busy. Grid patterns were drawn on charts with pencils that had erased too many lines and were now good at drawing hope in straight segments. Radios were all at once both useless and the only sound anyone could bear. Santa Lucia, this is coastal. A voice said, ready to be father and judge and friend, ready to say come home. Ready to say tell me anything you can. Say position. Static replied with admirable neutrality. They looked where a small boat could have gone if it had gone the way small boats go when they are cautious. They looked where a small boat might have gone if it had been more stubborn. They looked beyond both into the map's place where there is only depth soundings and tide arrows and the kind of blank space the optimistic call room and the older call the cemetery. Nothing. No flare, no plank, no slick. A buoy in kelp belonging to no one alive. A crate that had washed off a freighter 2 storms ago and was now a citizen of the coastline. On shore, dogs sniffed long arcs along beaches, noses low, tails held in attitudes of professionalism. Children stared from doorways as if staring hard would bring a man back out of water the way the right tone can summon a cat from under the couch. In the church of Nossa Senhora de Boa Viagem, the priest lit candles until wax puddled in pale lakes and said prayers almost as old as the tide. Women crossed themselves and then crossed themselves again when the wind struck the doors like a debt collector. In the tavern a man who had mocked Joaquim's stubbornness in small ways for 20 years chewed his knuckle and said nothing. Another man told the story of 73 when two cousins had drifted past the Berlingas and washed up 10 days later with skin like candle tallow and a grin that managed to be both grateful and bragging. Holding on to a story with a better outcome is a human right. The search continued into night because stopping is not something you do when there is still fuel and there are still eyes. At 3 in the morning, a helicopter crew thought they saw something. A smear of color not gray, a darker darkness. But the wave that would have confirmed it stood up and blocked the view, and then a new wave blocked that. At dawn, they tried again harder, because that is a thing people say when their options are all the same size. For 3 days they flew grids, sailed boxes, walked shorelines, counted, recounted, argued with math the way gamblers argue with dice. On the 7th day, the maritime commander read the sentence into the wind that ends the public part and begins the private part. We suspend active search with regret. Paperwork followed. crisp and cruel because there is no space on a form for what a village feels. One subject, male, presumed lost at sea. Grief in Peniche is a tide. It comes in with casseroles and heavy hands on shoulders, and the honest disturbance of laughter when somebody tells a story too good not to be told. It goes out with the week's work because nets must be mended and fish do not catch themselves, and children need shoes. Joachim's house stayed locked because there was no one to open it, and because the idea of a stranger sleeping in a bed where a marriage had become a widowhood was indecent. The cap hung by the door the way it had always hung, undisturbed now. The rosary sat on its shelf and became a small sculpture of patience. The notebook in its plastic waited for hands. The boat did not wait. The sea had its own opinion of her. After a month, men went out with better caution and worse sleep. After a year, Joachim had become a sentence in the tavern, spoken softly, sharpened by the paragraph of silence that followed. After 3 years, he had become a paragraph for tourists. There was a man, Ovelho Dumar, vanished one day in a red dawn. His boat was never found. After 5, he had become a cautionary tale that boys rolled their eyes at and girls listened to without blinking. Do not go out when the sky tells you not to. Do not argue with a wind that doesn't negotiate. Do not believe that habit makes you immune to accident. The priest, who had a more patient worldview, said in his homily one Sunday that we are all boats and we all return to the same harbor. The fishermen did not mind the poetry, exactly. They minded the theology because it did not specify dates. What people said about Joachim depended on what they needed from the story at the time they were telling it. Some said he had chosen it, the old way, the sailor's ending, rowing toward dark water to meet the family ledger. Others said he had been reckless, and if he had listened to men with radios instead of to bones that had been soaked in Atlantic longer than some boats have, he would have died in his bed and spared them this conversation. A few, drunk on melancholy and the couple of beers that make melancholy productive, said he had been picked up by a freighter and now lived in Belém do Pará, telling children the names of fish in a language he could not quite hear himself speaking. One boy, more practical and therefore ruder, said the boat had come apart and the sea had eaten him down to the idea of bones. His mother clapped him on the head and told him that some sentences were true and still shouldn't be said. The boy said he understood and then told the story again to his friend because that is the privilege of the young. 9 years is the amount of time it takes for routine to make room for legend. In that time, Nazar became famous again, not for what villagers have always known. The way the underwater canyon stands like a trumpet pressed to the mouth of the shore and makes waves taller than belief, but for a photograph of a surfer atop a wall of water big enough to be a political metaphor. Boards stood in restaurants beside nets and oars. Journalists with clean sneakers learned to pronounce Tsanhao and to write swell period. Tourists came to Peniche to see water behave like theater and to eat fish that did not know they were bringing pilgrims. The boat cooperatives received new members who carried their phones to sea and posted their returns, and who still, when the horizon did what horizons do, remembered to speak to it in the old phrases. In October 2017, a storm came through in the old way. Honest, unadorned, vigorous. It ripped tiles from roofs and made the harbor bite back. It rearranged the beach the way a child rearranges a sandbox the day before school starts, to make a point about what authority looks like. When it left, the sky looked scrubbed. The beach looked like a thrift store. Plastic mingled with driftwood, ropes with eelgrass, buckets with jellyfish whose names would not be known until someone got stung. A couple after lunch walked along the waterline where the seam between the tide's old project and the sand's new complaints was still being negotiated. He pointed to a shape and said, "Another log." She said, "No, the bow." They had to stand there while the wave did the thing waves do when they want to be dramatic. Recede slowly, as if reluctant to reveal, and then there it was. A bow with the ghost of paint on it, the particular slope of a batira that had known 1,000 exits and 1,000 returns. The letters were cut into the wood, not merely painted, and while time had scoured the paint away, the cuts remained. Santa Luzia. The woman put her hand to her mouth because some gestures are older than language. The man ran his palm over the plank and felt the truth of it the way one knows the truth of bread by its weight. Word travels faster than gulls when it wants to. The maritime police came with a practicality that, for once, did not need apologizing for. Lines were thrown, knots tied, a small machine puttered and pulled, and the boat slid onto the sand with the finality of a confession. She was intact in the way survivors are intact. Warped, scarred, stubbled with barnacles. Her seams stained the brown of tea, but herself. Inside lay a life in small objects. A knife whose edge had dulled into a more honest shape. A tobacco tin freckled with salt. A wool cap that had turned into a memory of wool, but still held the curve of a head. A rosary stiff with salt like a spine made of hailstones. A shallow plastic box sealed with tape, the tape gone opaque, and inside it the notebook. At the police station, the tape gave way with a sound that made everybody present think of breath. The notebook's cover had bowed, the way books do when their weather has outlived their writers. The pages inside were remarkably legible. Lines of tidy handwriting presented years as if they could be captured by numbers and short sentences. Date, tide, wind direction, catch weight. Remarks no more poetic than a recipe. Swell confused. Lights far north. Trawler. Tomorrow fix starboard cleat. The last page carried the last entry in that same hand. Dated the day he vanished. Weather turning. Still must go. It was not stubbornness as much as arithmetic in a man who had always found ways to solve days with work. The crowd at the quay that evening had the solemn excitement of people who had witnessed a miracle and required no thunderbolts to name it as such. Old men touched the bow as if it were a forehead. Women crossed themselves and then crossed themselves again because they had not theologically prepared for a relic that was also a piece of furniture. Children climbed onto the thwart before their mothers yanked them down by coats because respect must be demonstrated in high places. Someone suggested the boat belonged in the square. Someone else said it belonged in the church. In the end, because this is a village and decisions happen where people can see one another's faces, it was decided that the boat would sit in the square under a canopy when it rained and under sky when it did not, and that the notebook would be placed in a glass case beside Nossa Senhora de Boa Vigem, so a saint with her own particular interest in the safe passage of boats could keep an eye on the pages. Reporters arrived. They liked the phrase ghost boat because it felt like an argument with rationality without actually opposing it. They interviewed an oceanographer who described in patient television English how the North Atlantic gyre moves objects delighted to be moved for years at a time. How a wooden hull can, paradoxically, survive longer than a steel one if minuscule damage never compounds into rupture. How the Azores and a dozen other features mean that what leaves the Portuguese coast does not necessarily return by the route you would choose for it. He used the word stochastic once, and the cameraman pushed in on his face because words like that deserve close-ups. He also said, quieter, that 9 years of wandering for a hull that small meant she had threaded storms like a needle and luck like a saint. People nodded and did not change their minds about the saint part. The story returned to the village and rearranged the furniture of memory. For some, the boat's arrival was the end, proof that he had not left them by choice, proof that he had been exactly what he had always been, a man at sea doing the only job he had ever done, proof that the ocean can return what it borrowed without returning everything. For others, it opened new rooms of speculation. Had he been thrown overboard by a single wave that picked him up like a coin and refused to hand him back? Had he fallen ill, head dropped to chest, breath a mistake, body a weight that slid to water? Had he tied something down and come untied himself in the process? Had another vessel seen him and failed to see him? The notebook gave no hint. It ended where days end sometimes. In the middle of the kind of sentence that does not suspect it is last. There was a service. Of course there was. The priest who had watched the village grow pragmatic about miracles stood beside the boat because the church was not large enough to hold the curiosity of a region. He read the psalm about going down to the sea in ships and doing business in great waters, and came back to the part about those who mount up to the heaven and go down to the depths and cry unto the Lord in their trouble. The cry needs no language, he said, and it is heard whether or not anyone is listening for it. He sprinkled holy water not because wood needs it, but because people do. A woman who had always thought Joachim too stern said aloud, Perdoa, and meant it. Forgive him for leaving. Forgive him for staying gone. Forgive him for being a reminder that love is no guarantee of return. The fishermen's cooperative appointed 2 men to be custodians of the boat, not to own it. The word own rolled poorly in mouths for a thing that had reminded everyone of Luck's narrowness, but to maintain it. They oiled the planks and brushed the barnacles off her belly with a tenderness that almost hid, and only almost, the anger that men who have not yet died feel when confronted with how thin their line back to shore could be. Tourists came and petted the gunwale and took photographs. A child pressed a note under a nail head that read, in block letters as square as the boy's ears, "If you see my grandfather, please tell him I am tall now." Someone left a string of shells that clacked together when the wind turned the corner of the square the way it always had before and always would. If a village has a ledger, this is what it recorded afterward. The cap was taken to the church and sat beside the notebook as if the two had arranged to tell their story to one another. The tobacco tin was given to a cousin who did not smoke and kept it anyway. The knife was cleaned and set next to the boat in a glass box because even edges require context. The rosary hung from the prow exactly where Joachim's fingers had framed it on mornings he did not trust himself to hear anything else. Someone hung a small blue tile on the wall of his house with a painted boat and the words Nossa Senhora de Boa Vigem because ex votos are how people thank one another for outcomes that might not have had anything to do with one another. 9 years of silence had created a geography of absence. The boat's reappearance filled some of the map and left other portions blank. In the tavern, men argued about whether this was mercy. "It is better to have a body," one said, and earn nods from people who have carried coffins. "This is not a body," another said, and the bartender, who had been storing everyone's grief in clean glasses for a generation, said, "It is what we have." A young man said he would never go out on a red dawn, and an old one laughed without smiling and said, "You have already gone out on 100 red dawns. You just didn't see the sky." Someone tried to make a joke and failed. Someone else told a story about Joaquim tying knots better than sailors 30 years younger, and the room needed this very much and allowed itself to be warmed. There were practicalities. The police asked if any family remained who would claim the boat. A cousin said he was not the right kind of relative to make a claim, that if anyone owned Santa Luzia now, it was the people who had stood ankle-deep in surf to pull her in by the rub rails, that the village had shared the risk and should share the relic. Paperwork disagreed, and then, under the pressure of a crowd that does not appreciate the poetry of forms, decided it could be flexible. The municipality arranged a plinth and a plaque. The plaque said less than it needed to and more than anyone could comfortably carry past without reading. It included the date. It included a sentence the priest wrote and the mayor pretended to have written. "The sea keeps its own counsel. We keep one another." The metal shone briefly and then became the right color for the air. How did the boat survive? The oceanographer, cornered in a different interview, drew on a napkin the spiral that rules the open Atlantic and explained about the Azores current and the North Atlantic drift and how vessels the size of Santa Luzia can live indefinitely in the careful indifference of a gyre so long as their seams do not care enough to open. He said barnacles on the hull could tell a story about latitude and time if someone listened with a scalpel. He said storms can break a boat, and storms can lift it over the thing that would have broken it. He said, with the courage of a man who can be both correct and unwelcome, that what floats as long as it floats, and then it does not, and that we do not tend to hear from the ones that reach the second part of that equation. He told, when the camera was off because the anchor needed to refill his cup, a story about a buoy that turned up off Galicia with Portuguese rope on it, and how he once felt like a detective until he remembered he was only a historian of what currents decide. The notebook gave the kind of intimacy no interview achieves. Day after day in that tidy hand. Swell confused, fog afternoon. Gannet south, mackerel good. Men on trawler loud, friendly. North, cleat nearly gone. A small sketch of a coastline that could have been anywhere and was exactly where it needed to be. Between lines about wind and rope there were notes that only a lonely man would bother to write down where he also counted hooks. Dreamed of Anna. Hair wet. Boys on pier better at knots than their fathers. Fixed hands with vinegar and salt. Heard Fadu from a boat. Not ours. Who carries grief to sea? Everyone. The page with the last entry was unremarkable except for its position in the stack of time. Weather turning. Still must go. It read like a signature you would sign to a bill that had to be paid whether you wanted to see the amount or not. The house was opened at last. A woman from the cooperative took the key and stood in the doorway long enough to feel foolish and then crossed herself and went in. Dust had collected as if it were a hobby. The air smelled of rope and the metal that rope leaves behind forever. The bed held its shape like a vow. The kitchen was exactly the size of a marriage that had been interrupted before it could fully begin. She took down the cap. She set the rosary on the table because some objects need a surface to declare themselves. She stood in front of the photograph of Anna and said, "He came back as much as he could," and her voice fit the room the way a hand fits a glove it has inherited. The cooperative decided to keep the house as it was for a while because memory requires a stage, and then decided to rent it to a cousin's boy who would not repaint the blue stripe and would come home quiet and would, sometimes in winter, put his ear to the doorframe and listen to a sound that was not there but had been. Out at sea men told the boat story the way men who handle rope tell stories, in segments, with knots. We found her at Nazar, a square knot, tied after a storm had her in its hands, a clove hitch, name still cut into her, a bowline, things inside as if he had just gone to piss and would be right back, a half hitch. They told it with an admixture of pride and fear. Pride that a thing from their place had done a thing that made strangers show up with cameras. Fear that the math that had brought the boat back would someday be tried on their names. They went out on red dawns because work is a larger thing than omens. They came back on green afternoons and said nothing because gratitude prefers not to be overheard. If there was a boy who had once been slapped by his mother for saying a true thing too directly, he grew into a young man who, the winter after the boat came home, went out with men who had not yet found their replacements. He learned to talk to the palado crab as if it could sympathize with being pulled into light it had not applied for. He learned the way a line feels when it is lying to you, the way a wave leans when it intends you harm. He learned to read a barometer in the dark. He tied a new rosary to his own bow and did not tell anyone that he did not believe, because the point was not belief. The point was the stringing of beads, the counting, the way the hand works at a task, and the mind answers with calm. He went past the place where men had raised glasses and pointed and said there, and he did not look down. because looking down is not how you keep a boat on a course. In Lisbon, a museum called to ask if the boat could be borrowed for an exhibition about memory and the sea, about what we keep and what we lose. The cooperative said no politely, and the museum said they understood and did not. An art student came and made drawings of the boat's scars and talked about wabi-sabi and the beauty of decay, and a fisherman asked her to help him haul a crate, and she did, and at the end of the afternoon, she went home with hands that had learned a new adjective. A priest from Nazar visited and brought a small statue of Nossa Senhora de Nazar with a chipped base and left it under the bench as if the boat might want company when no one was looking. There were letters. A man from Porto wrote to say his father had vanished in 1996 and that every time he looked at his father's old raincoat, he felt relief and anger in the same square of chest. A woman from Madeira wrote to say that her brother had been lost 2 years ago and that the thing she could not forgive was the way the wind had made his name into a sound that did not sound like a name anymore. An American tourist sent a photograph of his child sitting on the edge of the plinth under the boat and said thank you for letting a stranger grieve with you. A fisherman from Galicia wrote to say that they had found a buoy marked Peniche 10 years earlier and had hung it in their tavern, and that it was nice to know that, sometimes, the current ran both ways. And there was the sea, which did not change and did. It continued to lift and set down men, to anger their wives by putting more salt in their sheets than was polite, to steal knives from the scuppers, to carry gossip from one boat to another in the medium of wind. It continued to draw the line beyond which what happens is not reportable in practical terms, and beyond which people still go because their lives point that way. Some mornings it wore a face children recognize in the mirror on good days. Some afternoons it went flat and iron gray and showed you your own reflection and you did not enjoy it. Some nights it glittered under a moon that seemed to have preferences, and those preferences did not include your comfort. If you asked it why it kept a man and returned his boat 9 years later, it would not lie. It would not tell you anything. In Peniche, there is now an extra pause in the morning when men kiss fingers and touch bows. It is not longer than the old pause. It is denser. Women are not kinder or crueler than they were. They are the exact mix of both that keeps a village upright. Children do not stop asking why. They learn faster that some whys are projects without deadlines. The boat sits in the square on her plinth, her name cut into her the way names are sometimes cut into stone. She gathers dust from the footfalls of tourists and salt from the air that cannot be cured out of wood and stories from the conversations that happen around her as if she were a fire and people were cold. The notebook sits behind glass at Nossa Senhora's altar and gathers prayers it does not need, and next to it is a small sign that says, in Portuguese and English, please do not touch, as if touch were the problem. On anniversaries, the cooperative and the families of 3 other men who went out and did not come back take a dinghy to the line where the sea stops pretending to be shallow and throw flowers that do not sink quickly. They speak names, Joaquim Duarte and others. They do not make speeches. They do not take photographs. One of them brings a bottle and pours some into the water and drinks some and passes it, and the bottle does the circuit, and by the time it comes back the flowers have become dots, and then have gone under, and there is only water and the boat in the reduction of all things into a kind of arithmetic that the villagers do not teach in school because there are not enough rooms. If you ask the priest, he will say the moral is that life is a voyage, and we are all returned to the same port, and that God writes straight with crooked lines. If you ask the oceanographer, he will say the lesson is that currents are patient and probability unromantic, that what floats until it does not, that what we see is a sample size denying its own lack of authority. If you ask the men who pull nets and mend them, they will say there is no moral, only a list. Check the weather, tie your knots. Do not pretend the sea owes you anything. Leave word with someone who loves you. Carry a notebook because what you write might be all that returns. If you ask the woman who runs her fingers along the boat's gunwale on her way to buy bread, she will say she comes this way because, on certain mornings, smelling old salt and old wood is the only way she remembers how to breathe in a house that remembers a particular pair of boots by sound. They said the sea had taken him. 9 years later the boat returned, scarred and intact, carrying in its belly the small museum of a man's pockets. The man did not return. The village learned again the simple math of tides. The sea keeps, the sea gives, the sea explains nothing. The story settles into the square like a piece of furniture you bump your hip on twice a week and learn to aim around without ever forgetting it is there. If there is a last word, it does not belong to a priest or a journalist or an oceanographer or a fisherman. It belongs to the Atlantic, which does not speak in sentences. It speaks in fetch and swell and gust and stillness, in the long patience of gyres, in the quiet of a harbor at 4 in the morning when a man kisses his fingers, touches wood, and climbs into a boat whose name means light, and rows into a dark that takes and gives and keeps its own counsel.